Israel has confirmed it's killed a Palestinian journalist from the Jazeera news organisation in a targeted bombing. Journalists Anas Al-Sharif and Mohammed Qreiqeh were killed alongside camera operators Ibrahim Zaher, Mohammed Noufal and Moamen Aliwa when Israel bombed a journalist's tent in Gaza City. Israel had been openly threatening to kill Al-Sharif for several weeks, claiming he was an Hamas operative. Al-Sharif and Al Jazeera had strongly denied the accusation.
Israel have admitted targeting a journalist tent that was situated next to a hospital in Gaza City, where we're seeing a new offensive by Israel against the town, against the city, and that it was deliberately targeting Anas Al-Sharif, whom it has for many months alleged is a terrorist, a Hamas operative, without providing any proof. But of course, it wasn't just Anas that was killed in this attack. It was the entire, we understand, Al Jazeera news crew for Gaza City and a number of other journalists and media workers, we believe, as well.
You mentioned there, Jodie, the IDF confirming that strike and saying that Anas Al-Sharif served as the head of a terrorist cell in the Hamas terrorist organisation and was responsible for advancing rocket attacks against Israeli civilians and IDF forces. What is your response to those claims?
Well, as I say, we haven't seen any credible evidence from Israel that this is the case. And frankly, this is part of a pattern that we've long seen from Israel, not just in the current war, but in previous decades, in which it kills journalists. It then subsequently alleges, without providing any credible evidence, that they are terrorist operatives. And we've seen that in the case of Anas Al-Sharif and a number of other journalists killed in this war. Unusually in this war, we've seen Israel allege that journalists are terrorists ahead of time. In what Anas and other journalists have said, and we have said, seems to be a precursor to their killing and justifying their murders.
Israel has denied that it targets journalists, but what can you tell us about what this group of journalists and camera operators had been reporting on since the start of the war?
Well, it's important to remember, firstly, that no international journalists have been given any kind of independent access to Gaza since the start of the war. So for 22 months, it is only Gazan, only Palestinian journalists who've been able to report on the war. Anas is one of the probably the best known faces of the war. He has reported day in, day out for Al Jazeera since the start of the war. 2 weeks ago, before the latest smear campaign by an Israeli army spokesperson began, Anas was crying on air, talking about the starvation facing Gazans and facing his own family, and the starvation that was being experienced by journalists themselves as they report on what's happening inside Gaza.
Given that lack of access of international journalists, which we know is commonly reported on, how do you verify and monitor the casualties and the deaths of journalists in the region?
So we take the same approach to Gaza as we do to any country, any war zone. So we have to have at least two independent sources, that the individual was indeed a journalist, and independent verification that they have been killed. As you say, since the start of the war, we've seen a record number of journalists killed, at least 186 journalists killed since October the 7th, 2023, of which 178 of those are Palestinians killed by Israel. And of course, today's killings brings that number much higher. That's unprecedented for a war zone.
You had been calling for the protection of Anas Al-Sharif. Where were you at with those calls, and where were you up to?
Well, we had been highlighting the dangers that we felt that Anas was in. He had already been subject to these allegations back in October. We raised that issue then. We again, 2 weeks ago, called out these smears and the concerns that we had and asked for him to be protected. Unfortunately, as we have seen repeatedly throughout this war, the reaction of the international community has been lukewarm at best. Journalists are civilians. They should never be targeted in a war, and to do so deliberately is a war crime.
What concerns do you have and fear for those journalists remaining?
Well, it's clear that there is no protection available to those journalists. And not only have we seen examples where journalists have clearly been deliberately targeted for their work, we believe at least 17 journalists deliberately targeted as journalists for their work, but the number may be higher. Of course, they are experiencing all the kind of same deprivations as every other Gazan. So they are subject to starvation, continual displacement, the deterioration of equipment, communications blackouts, whilst trying to report on a war that is deeply impacting them personally, the deaths of loved ones, repeated bombings, drones overhead. And so we are extremely concerned that we were going to simply see more and more of these deaths as the offensive in Gaza continues.
Jodie Ginsberg, CEO of the Committee to Protect Journalists, many thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And the IDF has put out a statement following the strike, reiterating their position that Anas Al-Sharif was a terrorist posing as a journalist for the Al Jazeera network, while Al Jazeera has also put out its own statement condemning what it calls is the targeted assassination of its correspondents and photographers.